Tonight, the Kevorkian Center is launching a special series of talks marking 170 and 50 years since the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinian Nakba, and the creation of the State of Israel and the occupation of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, respectively. We thought, I don't know about long and hard, but we thought about what we should be calling this series. You know, something like lasting markers of international contradictory interests in the region, or maybe heightened moments of trauma in Palestinian history, or maybe notable gains of Zionism, or towards the State of Israel and beyond, or the heights and effects of various forms of colonialism, post-colonialism, settler colonialism, anti-colonialism, and so on. Admittedly, we opted for perhaps what is the most abstract, but I think also very specific wording. Abstract because we're not just, abstract because we're obviously playing with the idea of numbers somehow being significant, and that there's some significance in thinking behind what lies behind a bunch of numbers. But of course, 170 and 50 are also specific because they do refer to three dates that undoubtedly have had long-lasting effects for Palestinians, for Jews, for Israelis, for Christians, for Muslims, for the Middle East region, and the world at large. But it wasn't a shying away from any controversy that we chose to call the series 170-50. Of course, as human beings, we like to mark dates, we like to celebrate anniversaries, we obsess about birthdays, and then at some point in life we try to forget about birthdays. We celebrate New Year's, and I think equally for Palestinians and Israelis, certain numbers take on salient meaning, not all of which are necessarily dates. So yes, there's 1917, there's 1948, there's 1982, there's 1987, there's 181, 212, 338. But this is not about numbers, as much as it is about an understanding of the unfolding of history through the analysis of the eminent historians who are partaking in the series. So tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Rashid Khalidi, and on October 10th, we'll have Professor Shira Robinson, and on November 15th, Professor Gershon Shafir. If we think of history as the object to be known, certain moments, processes, practices, even documents become intelligible. And I mean intelligible in its philosophical meaning, in terms of what it is that we can comprehend within the limits of the human mind, but also intelligible perhaps as a kind of method which we can use to find and locate at any given moment a historical temporalization that appears totalizing. Or to put it another way, that history is intelligible in that we can find conspicuous, explicit connections between all or any of its parts. According to Hegel, and you've got to forgive me because I'm actually teaching the theory seminar in my department, so there's a lot of Hegel and Marx going on in my head right now. But according to Hegel, history is not a succession of events, or, in his words, a gallery of images, but something that is conceptually grasped. History is intelligible, he says, since it is constructed through the actions of human beings. And for him, actions which are always rational and hence cognizable. Later, other theorists would argue that perhaps it's not rationality, but maybe economic grounds that we ought to be looking for. But either way, intelligibility is a result of totalization, which is not simply a process, but the result of past activities and practices which appear as internally related to a whole. In other words, time is not given to man, but conversely, man defines time through temporalization. The point I just want to make is that although Hegel was conspicuous amongst philosophers and claiming to be able to make entire cultures or even human history intelligible, what he does offer us is an insightful argument, that history is conscious, that what he calls Erinnerung is a reconstruction of the past from the perspective of the present that turns past events into a history, a kind of ordering of the moments of significant contribution. So 170-50, or 1917, 1948, 1967, 2017. What are the traceable connections? What connects these years? And then there's the broader question of whether any connections are traceable in the world of fact. Both questions, I think, are apparent enough. On the one hand, a philosopher's most pressing problem is still whether historical events are intrinsically or intelligibly related. On the other hand, it is the work of the historian to do more than see intrinsic connections between events, that he can go further and understand the course of history as a whole, so that he is able to say, in perhaps less Hegelian or abstract kind of language, that the history of Israel-Palestine, for example, makes sense, or that it is meaningful, or that maybe it has a kind of rhyme and reason. So I would venture to say that 1917, 1948, 1967 are not just moments that offer us legible or decipherable documents, procedures, or actions, but become, in the hands of historians such as Rashid Khalidi, comprehensible, unequivocal events that give meaning. The problem, of course, of intelligibility is not only the difference between explaining and understanding, it is also related to the totalities one is seeking to understand, from an individual life to a conflict. And in moving from an elementary example to vaster ones, intelligibility slips from a practical meaning to a proper metaphysical one, from an intrinsic understanding of man's behavior to the ultimate meaning of the human adventure. So it's not simply that we stand in 2017 and look back 170 or 50 years, but that we explain and understand the unmistakable legacies of 1917, 48, and 67 that give meaning to the world that we have inherited and without which our present moment would not be what it is. Certainly standing in 2017, those 3 years, those 3 events, if you want, are intelligible parts of a related whole. In the case of 1917, we're obviously zooming in on the Balfour Declaration, a public statement that was issued by the British government during World War I, a few days after the penning of a, I think, secret letter for the first few days by the then United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur James Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, whose opening words were the first public support for Zionism by a major political power. They read, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." The significance obviously lies in the text, but also in its aftermath. The intended boundaries were not specified. Whether it was a Jewish state rather than a national home that was being contemplated was also vague. The term national home, I don't think, had any precedent in international law at the time. The document, regardless of its ambiguities, laid the foundation of what would become the British Mandate of Palestine. It would galvanize support for Zionism beyond the confines that it lived within up until that moment. It changed the landscape, if you will, both of Europe, but also inevitably of Palestine. The Balfour Declaration fomented the roots of the conflict that a century later, in 2017, we still live with, and that historians, whom we have the pleasure of hosting, help us dissect, situate, order, or really make intelligible. So it's a pleasure to be introducing Rashid Khalidi tonight, who's the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University, who teaches both in the departments of history as well as MISAS, and I'm not even going to try to decipher MISAS, but I think most of us know more or less what it stands for. With a bachelor's degree from Yale and a DPhil from Oxford, he's taught at various universities, including AUB, Georgetown, and the University of Chicago. He's currently the director of the Middle East Institute of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. He's the co-founder and current co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia. He's the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, serves on the board of the Institute of Palestine Studies, and has also been at one point the president of MESA. Professor Khalidi's research is primarily on the history of the modern Middle East, with a particular focus on the Levant and Palestine. He's written a great deal on the emergence of national identities, the role of the press, the role played by external powers in the development of the modern Levant, and lately with a particular focus on the US's pernicious role. Some of his books include Brokers of Deceit, which came out in 2013, Sowing Crisis, American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East, The Iron Cage, the story of the Palestinian struggle for statehood, Resurrecting Empire, Western Footprints, and America's Perilous Path in the Middle East, Palestinian Identity, The Construction of Modern National Consciousness, Under Siege, PLO Decision-Making During the 1982 War, British Policy Towards Syria and Palestine, and many other monographs, edited volumes, and articles. Professor Khalidi, I would venture to say, is perhaps the premier Palestinian public intellectual. I hope you don't mind me saying that about you. He regularly appears on radio and television. You've probably seen him on All Things, or heard him on All Things Considered, The Charlie Rose Show, my dad's favorite, the NewsHour, and various other outlets in the US. In fact, today, he gave an interview on Sabra and Shatila, which is available for you to listen to on WBAI's Law and Disorder. He's also been published and heard across global and transnational media platforms, whether it's Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, BBC, or many others. And I think I might say that maybe he's the only Palestinian who seems to have a direct line to the New York Times. So it's wonderful to always kind of read those words there. Our very own Zachary Lockman, who will be moderating as well as kind of responding throughout the series, is professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and History here at NYU, where he's also served at one point or another as chair of MEIS, and I think even standing in my spot as the director of the Kevorkian. Professor Lockman's research covers questions of the social roots of nationalism in the Middle East, workers, worker rights, and worker movements in the Levant and Egypt, questions of land and labor in the Zionist movement, and more recently, the creation of Middle East studies as a discipline here in the US and elsewhere, as well as more broadly, the US policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. He's also served as president of MESA and currently serves as the chair of MESA's Committee on Academic Freedom that deals on academic freedom. And he's also a contributing editor of the Middle East Report. Some of his books include most recently Field Notes, The Making of Middle East Studies in the United States, Contending Visions of the Middle East, The History and Politics of Orientalism, Workers on the Nile, Nationalism, Communism, Islam, and the Egyptian Working Class with Joel Bainin, Comrades and Enemies, Arab and Jewish Workers in Palestine, and also with Joel Bainin, the co-editor of Intifada. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome both of you, and I look forward to an even hotter environment.
Thank you, Elga, for that lovely introduction. I wish I did have a direct pipeline to the New York Times. They wouldn't have Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss writing for them regularly if I did. Okay.
We'll open the floor to questions. Keep your questions, please, focused.
Very brief footnote on socialism.
Right.
Which is not what you used, but in the British context, that remark you made about which kind of Jewish immigration.
Right.
The idea that the East End and these were anarchists, socialists, and so on, which had a profound effect on all sorts of wings of the British Labour Party, which also gave a lot of support to the idea of Zionism and a sort of idealized notion of kibbutzim and so on, but that lasts right through the 70s and 80s. I'm not talking now about people like Crossman and this sort of intellectual elite of Oxbridge who was saying this splendid idea. I'm talking about people who were invested in this notion that this was socialist. And that gave it a language, an international language of a totally opposing kind. Well, you and Montague and others would be horrified. I don't want to keep on that side of the story, but it should get back to the Palestinians, obviously. But,
Well, I won't comment on that because you're absolutely right. This is a yet another of the many ways in which the Zionist movement is able to appeal to entirely different constituencies. Questions?
Yeah, please, in the corner.
My question is whether your claim about the Zionist sovereign aims at that period is really important for your other claim about the war declaration that this is, because I think it is also anachronistic to an extent, and a product of the Zionist indoctrination of later years. I think at that period, the imagination of the Zionist leaders and theorists could not go that far. It could go to sovereignty as some kind of demi-sovereignty. But the international law experiences that these people had in the Eastern empires as well as in the Western empires, so in multinational empires like Russia and Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and in protectorate contexts of British and French empires, could sustain some kind of protection and some kind of demi-sovereignty, but not a strong sovereignty that we think about in the context of self-determination. And I don't think it has implication or argument. I just think it's important to put this.
Well, I mean, I disagree with you. I think that reading anything that Herzl wrote carefully, his diaries, Der Judenstaat, Altneuland, and reading the confidential transcripts of meetings between Weizmann and the British, especially meetings that were sort of off the record. Weizmann in his diaries talks about a dinner, I believe at Balfour's house with Lloyd George and Churchill in, I think, 1922, in which they say to him, of course, what we mean is a state. This is what national home means: state, sovereignty. Herzl talks about control of immigration, and he talks about sovereignty in his diaries. And he says, at Basel, I created the state. So I actually think that even though they understood that this would take a very long time, you had to have a majority. And that meant a lot of immigration and a lot of investment and a lot of land purchase and a lot of settlement and so on and so forth. And the British had to suppress indigenous resistance. And that I'm sure they estimated would take decades. In fact, Herzl said it would take decades in his diaries. That was their objective. They knew they weren't going to have it in 1921 or 22. Though, if you read the British response to the first Zionist Commission, the first Zionist Commission arrives acting as if we are the sovereigns here, and you will do what we want, and we want this and this and this. And the British were mortally offended, because these were, after all, in the eyes of British officers, many of whom were anti-Semites, not fully on their level. And yet, I think the unvarnished impression that they give gives us a sense of exactly the sense of entitlement and the sense of where a lot of leaders of the Zionist movement thought this was going. This was going to a majority and to statehood and to sovereignty and to control, most importantly, over immigration. And Herzl says that. Now, many Zionist leaders didn't think that maybe, but the key ones like Weizmann and Herzl, I think, did. Yes, Abdeen, and then back there.
With regard to this issue about Netanyahu objecting to the anti-Semites in Charlottesville and so forth, and not raising that, isn't it true that the whole idea that there's no need to fight anti-Semitism because of the bacillus in Gentile culture? I mean, it's something you can't avoid.
I mean, that certainly is Netanyahu's point of view. He said something sort of like that in France. Exactly when, and I don't remember where, to a gathering of French Jews. And they were not positive towards what he said. They got up and started singing the Marseillaise instead of Hatikva, which you look at the video of it, he's sort of shocked. And then he realizes what's happened. I haven't convinced them. But I think he, like his father, who incidentally was the private secretary of Jabotinsky, both, I think, have a very dark worldview. They will kill us in every generation. We only can rely on ourselves. We will have to fight and fight and fight. And he said these things himself, but it's in his father's history of Spain as well, Ben-Zion Netanyahu's work. So yeah, I think it's in his worldview. Back in the back on the left. Let me try and answer them. Okay, I'll try and repeat. I'll summarize both of them. The first question is, what comparison can one make between Algeria and Palestine? 132 years of colonialism and what I've argued is a 100-year colonial war. The second question is, how does one deal with the erasure of memory where even in the Arab world, where until a few years ago there was some sense of what had happened in Palestine, whether massacres or whether partition or whatever it may be, since the Arab uprisings in particular and the terrible things that have happened to many parts of the Arab world. The destruction of 5 countries. I mean, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, 4 countries. Yemen, Libya, Iraq, and Syria are suffering civil wars and external intervention even as we speak. How does one deal with the erasure of memory, and even more so in the American context? Is that a summary of your second question? Okay, the first question, I mean, I think there is something to be gained from looking at any colonial settler movement or any colonial conflict in comparative perspective. But I'm a historian, and I look at specificities. And one of the things I would argue is that you can learn from a theorist like Patrick Wolf, who talks about settlement. Colonialism is a structure; it's an ongoing process. It's not just an event. There's some brilliant insights that can be derived from that and from considering colonialism in general. But each colonial case has its specificities. The way the French operated in Algeria was very different to the way the British operated in South Africa. And the white population in South Africa was very different to the white population in Algeria. And different to what became Namibia, Southern Rhodesia, what became Namibia. Zambia, actually. And different, I don't want to do a Trump and say Nambia. And quite different to the major European settler colonies of North America and Australasia, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and Canada, or the Spanish colonies, where in each case an indigenous population was subjugated. Very different things happened in every one of those cases. Spanish colonialism is completely different than British colonialism. It's completely different, or French colonialism. And French is different from British. And Zionism and what Zionism and the British did in Palestine shares some characteristics with every settler colonial movement, and in some respects is entirely different. The Spaniards baptized everybody, all of whom became Catholic, and spread their language. And so you have an aristocracy which claims descent from Spanish conquistadors, but there's no difference between the colonized and the colonizer, at least in principle. The British never admitted the colonized. I mean, go see Victoria and Abdul. He's an Indian. Victoria admits an Indian to her household. And there's shock and horror in a way which is a function of what British colonialism, the principles on which British colonialism operated. French colonialism is different. So there's a lot of benefit to be derived from these in my view, from comparison of these settler colonial cases. But you have to also be aware of some of the things that I stressed. This was both a movement supported by the British, but for which Britain was not the metropole. The colons in Algeria were lost when the French turned against them. They were lost when the French public decided it did not want to fight this war. That was it. That was the metropole. That was it. They had no recourse. Even though part of the army supported them, they had no recourse. But that Zionism never depended on the British in that way. In 1939, the British turned against the Zionist movement. They decide that their interests in the Arab world are vital, that World War II is coming, that they have to cut a deal. They issue the white paper. The Zionist movement starts attacking the British almost immediately, and soon moves its base to the United States, and then gets the support of the Soviet Union, and then goes back to Britain and France. In other words, it's an independent actor in a way that no other colonists ever were. You could not have destroyed the Native Americans. You could not have destroyed the First Nations in Canada without the American and first the British, and later the American and the British armies. It would not have been possible. It simply would not have been possible. Zionism hopped from one sponsor to another. So there are important differences between each of these settler colonies, I would argue. And South Africa is an entirely different case. So again, when I hear these descriptions of attempts to use the term apartheid, yes, well, but. I mean, the specificities are, to my way of thinking anyway, very important as well. Other questions in the back? I didn't answer the second question. What was the second question? That's a very hard question, and I tell you, I'm not going to answer that for a very simple reason. The situation that the Arab world is in is one of such absolute agony that I think it's worth questioning to what extent, at this moment in time, is there an Arab world? I mean, in the time of Abdel Nasser, and even in the 30s, you had a certain mass public that resonated to the same things. So when the Palestinians rose up in 1936, you go to the French Foreign Ministry archives and you have French Muslims, Algerian Muslims trying to contribute to support the Palestinians. They weren't allowed to do so, of course, by the French colonial authorities. But you had people coming from Lebanon, you had people coming from Syria to fight with the Palestinians. So you had a resonance throughout the Arab world of the Palestine case. And that was true in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, even though the regimes generally tended to do what the great powers wanted. So if you look at what's happening in the 40s, in 1947, 48, every Arab government is paying much more attention to the British or the Americans or other external powers than they are to the Palestinians. Public opinion, however, is resonating to what's happening in Palestine. Today, in the situation of fragmentation in the Arab world, that's just so much harder. And today, by today, I mean the last decade or so. So you're really right, not just the Arab uprisings, but this recent period. And how can you tell a Syrian whose country has been destroyed, and a quarter of whose population have been made refugees, and who are having to deal with this horrific regime, and with an armed opposition which is made up of people who would probably cut the throats of a quarter or a fifth of the population if they got into power. So you have, on the one hand, the devil, and on the other hand, you have the deep blue sea. How do you tell a Syrian, agonizing over that situation, Palestine's more important? Actually, it's not more important to them. This is life and death. This is existential. Same is true for Iraqis. Same is true for Yemenis. Same is true for Libyans. I mean, the question of whether those countries will even exist is on the table. The question of how many hundreds of thousands of Yemeni children will be permanently damaged by the starvation that's been inflicted on them by the Saudi blockade and the war. You have to pay attention to those things if you're Yemeni or if you're a human being, a sentient human being. And one could go on and on. So I can't say as I blame people, frankly. But it's a very good question. I don't know the answer. In the back, yes.
I was wondering if that connection between Zionism as a political ideology, as a secular movement,
right,
and on one hand, and Palestine as the homeland, on the other hand, was kind of natural from the beginning, or more the result of history and the role of Christian Zionists. And number two, which is not related at all,
I said only one question.
Just on the Kurdish, the Israeli support for the Kurds national movement.
So I'm not really the person to ask about Zionism. But I would argue that, no, it was not Christian Zionism that drove Zionism. Political Zionism. Political Zionism latched on to things that were pre-existing, like any nationalism. It latched on to things that were pre-existing. And one of them was this attachment to the land of Israel, which is religious. And it transformed that into a national bond. Now, were there people willing to go elsewhere? Yes. At various stages in the first few years from the Basel Conference of 1897 through the first 3 or maybe 4 Zionist congresses, there was a debate over whether Uganda or Sinai or Argentina were potential, but it was overdetermined, really, that it should go, in my view, in the direction that it went. What was the second part? Oh, Kurds. I gave a talk at Harvard about the 3 unhealed wounds of World War I, one of which is Palestine, one of which is Kurdistan, and one of which is Armenia. And these are all places where there were promises made to the indigenous population. In the case of the Palestinians, via the Hussein McMahon correspondence and various other British pledges, which were then not fulfilled as a result of the Balfour Declaration. And these are 3 cases where you have peoples or putative peoples in formation, which are promised around World War I by the great powers, something, which the great powers don't grant them. The Armenians later get a tiny little Armenia as part of the Soviet Union, and they have now, on a fraction of their ancestral homeland, a Armenian republic. But the other 2 peoples have not achieved self-determination. Now, one of the tragedies of Palestinian history is that they never been able to develop a reliable external patron. The Zionist movement has leapt like a polar bear from iceberg to iceberg, from patron to patron to patron, and now they've finally fastened onto the United States. But even as we speak, you have Netanyahu going to China, going to India, going to Russia, making sure that there are a couple of other icebergs ready just in case. Because there's a profound understanding of the extent to which this whole project is dependent on external support. I mean, the terms that I gave you about the money that was going in the 20s and the 30s, there's $1 billion something every year in charitable donations. People are not paying taxes on money they send to support the Israel Defense Forces or support occupation and settlement. They're 501c3s, charitable, tax deductible. I mean, huge amounts of money are going just from this country. And you cannot, the project doesn't work the way it works without $3.8 billion worth of arms today and for the next 10 years and so on and so forth. Nor the Palestinians nor the Kurds were ever able to find that kind of reliable external support. And when the Kurds did find external support, as they found in the 50s, well, they found the first support in the 1940s, and they established the Republic of Mahabad. And they thought that they had established a Kurdish republic. And guess what? The external support disappeared when the Soviets cut a deal with the Iranians. And they allowed the Iranian army to come in and hang everybody who had established the Kurdish Mahabad Republic. One of the few people to escape was a fellow by the name of Mullah Mustafa Barzani, who escaped to Moscow, which was his patron. And later on, he shows up in Kurdistan, and he finds other patrons in Washington and in Tel Aviv. So the Israeli military and intelligence services in the United States for various periods support the Kurds against the Iraqi regime. When the Iraqi regime is at the height of committing atrocities against the Kurds, the Shah of Iran cuts a deal with Saddam Hussein in 1975, the Algiers Accord. The rug's pulled out from under their feet. I fear that they have, even though they have managed to find external patrons at different times, these patrons in the present will prove just as unreliable as the patrons they found in the 60s and the 70s. I don't think the United States has any intention of supporting Kurdish independence in the long term. It may go along with whatever the result of the referendum is today for a time, but interests will determine, much larger interests will determine what the position of the United States is on this. And my guess is what Kissinger said, covert action is not to be confused with missionary work, will apply to whichever administration is going to be guilty of betraying the Kurds whenever that happens, whether it's in 2017 or 2020 or 2018 or 19, it almost doesn't matter. And the fact that Netanyahu supports the Kurds is no surprise. But that and 5 cents won't get you a cup of coffee. It'll be the United States or not. And the fact that you have every single country in the neighborhood is violently opposed to the idea of an independent Kurdistan means that they're going to have a very tough row to hoe. They're going to need extraordinary external support to pull it off. And that means a superpower. I mean, who has the power projection capability? Israel doesn't. No European country, Russia doesn't. Nobody has that. Against Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, and later whenever there's a Syria, if there's a Syria. It's a really daunting prospect, and they have a very, very tough. Any way you cut it, they're in a tough situation, and they're in that situation partly because through their own efforts they've achieved the degree of autonomy that they've achieved. But those efforts were aided mightily by the United States establishing a no-fly zone over northern Iraq and preventing the Iraqi regime from doing to the Kurds with its air power and its helicopters and its butchery what they did to the Shia in the south of Iraq in 1991. So the United States extended an umbrella for its own reasons over Kurdistan, which is where Kurdish autonomy has flourished. The day that Washington decides to withdraw that umbrella, things will change. It's a very grim prospect, I'm sorry, but... Yeah.
Your argument about the precision of the Balfour Declaration, despite the historical details you've added about the way it was manipulated later, suggests, since political rights are mentioned only for people outside of Palestine.
And for the Jews.
I know, but I mean, nobody is promised political rights in Palestine. It suggests that the Balfour Declaration is more aimed at establishing a British beachhead than it is in doing anything for anybody, Jewish or non-Jewish, in that part of the world.
Yeah.
To what extent is that historically justified?
I am completely convinced from my own period before World War I that British strategic interests entirely determined the course of this whole issue. This is why they did what they did. There were other factors that were really important, but British strategic interests determined what the British did. Sentiment had a marginal role, and religion had a marginal role. Lobbying, Weizmann was a chemist who had provided blah, blah. Yeah, those were important things, but it was British strategic interests. That was the be-all and the end-all. And the idea that you had a colony, a colonial, self-described colonial movement that was allied to Britain was something that the British, thought of positively. That would help them to achieve their nationalism. This ties into what you asked, because even though British statesmen told Weizmann in 1922, the three most responsible told him, it's going to be a state. Did they mean an independent state, or did they mean a state within the British Commonwealth, or whatever their understanding of that was? The Zionists knew what they wanted, and they knew that they could do it, and they were right. Basically, Churchill and Balfour and Lloyd George were not. Other questions? Yes.
So I'm curious if in the time frame you work in, if there are anti-nationalist imaginaries or formations in Palestine or amongst Palestinians that predate maybe more recent articulations or thinking around anti-nationalism or imagining Palestine beyond the nation state immigration in the future.
The person who's most persuasively made the argument I'm about to present to you in answer to your question is Musa Budayri, who's written mainly on communism. That's most of his published work in English and Arabic. But he's argued in a couple of book reviews and in a couple of fragmentary articles that are hard to find, so I can't refer you to a specific text, that in fact Palestinian identity and Palestinian nationalism were much less important in the period before World War I, through World War I, and into the 20s than were various other transnational sentiments. Now, these were not necessarily anti-nationalist, but they involved a broader polity than just Palestine. And in fact, Mohammed Musleh, in his book on Palestinian nationalism, sort of says the same thing, that there were different trends. The problem was that the pan-Arab trend, which is one of them, is faced with disappointment and defeat after disappointment and defeat. Up until the expulsion of Faisal from Damascus after the Battle of Maysanun in 1920, I would argue probably the pan-Arab idea had a greater hold over people in all of Bilad al-Sham, in all of Greater Syria, in Lebanon, in Syria, and Transjordan, and in Syria itself, than did any national idea. But Gelvin has shown us that in Syria there were people who didn't like the pan-Arab idea. Eugene Rogan has shown us the beginnings of a sense of a Transjordan, even before World War I. And Lebanon clearly had people who were thinking of Lebanon as an idea of Lebanon that transcended any other transnational loyalty. And then there was a pan-Syrian identity, which later develops into Hizb al-Qawmi al-Suri al-Ijtimai, the PPS so-called. So there are various transnational, and then there's communism, which has a whole other transnational logic to it. And which has, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, there are devotees of communism. And there are people like Shakib Arslan and other luminaries who are, on the one hand, described as Arab nationalists, but who are talking to the Soviets, who are talking to Indian nationalists, people in the Congress Party, talking to Irish nationalists, talking to everybody. So they're nationalists of a sort, and they're international revolutionaries of a sort. And somebody like Shakib is also a Druze and a Lebanese and a Syrian nationalist, as well as being an Arab nationalist and an Islamic nationalist. And then there's finally Pan-Islam, which has a purview and a weight in the subcontinent, but also out. A lot of people fastened their hopes to Ibn Saud as a pan-Islamic leader, not as and others fastened their hopes to him as an Arab leader. So Amin Rihani goes to him as an Arab leader and writes this glowing biography of Ibn Saud and propagandizes for him. Others go to him and proselytize on his behalf as a great Islamic leader. So there are other trends than this narrow nation-state nationalism. But again, we're obsessed with the present. Even historians are obsessed with the present. We're seeing the past from the perspective of the present. And since these nationalisms, whether it's Zionism or Palestinian nationalism, whatever, have taken over and occupied all the space and driven out everything else, we look for their origins, even though their origins may not be as important in 1920 or 1914 or whatever, as they might have later become. So it's a good question. Yes?
That's the last question.
Okay, but this lady also had her hand up, so two questions. You first and then you. I promised you, so I will take your question. Yes?
I was curious about the question of international laws as source of legitimacy, which is sort of the third part of your treatment line. And it just seems to me like on the question of Israel, both sides use this argument, but in opposite directions. Right. And it doesn't really seem like the two sides ever engage on the issue. So I was just curious if you think this is something that is resolvable in an academic setting in terms of analyzing the actual merits of these claims to international legitimacy, or if it's just sort of a political volleyball that's used as a tool.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are several levels. There's the political level, there's the discursive level, the media and so on, and then there's the academic level. And even on the academic level, it's very hard to solve because a lot of Palestinian official rhetoric is linked to the idea of international legitimacy, Shari'iyya Dawliyya. Well, my reading of international legitimacy is it's been used against the Palestinians in all of the instances that I've cited. Resolution 242, Resolution 181, General Assembly Resolution 181 of 29th of November 1947, and the League of Nations Mandate and the Balfour Declaration. So power politics and other things are what determined outcomes, in my view. But I think you can hash it out on an academic level a little more easily than you can hash it out on, Breitbart and MSNBC. Not even to speak of the political level. God help us. Last question.
He wrote to the Zionists that in order to succeed, they had to destroy all hope.
That's right.
And keep it destroyed. Never let it rise.
Right.
Is this the way we should interpret what's going on with the constant destruction of Gaza, murders there all the time, arresting the children all the time? Yeah. Is this what this is? I don't
know if the political current that's dominated Israel since the 70s, 1977, which is rooted in Jabotinsky's thinking, if people like Benjamin Netanyahu actually sit down and read Jabotinsky every night. I somehow doubt it. Because there's a lot of stuff in there that they really wouldn't like. But I think that is part of the logic of a colonial project. If you don't beat them down, they will come back. I mean, that's what was done to Native Americans in this country. It's what has to be done in a colonial setting. And, the problem here is you have a 19th century nationalism, Zionism, operating through a 19th century colonial movement in the 20th and 21st century. It's a very hard thing to do. And it constantly keeps coming up against the fact that not enough people were dispossessed or expelled. In the Algerian context, the colons had the same problem. They just couldn't overcome the resistance of the overwhelming mass of the native indigenous population, the Algerians. Same thing happened ultimately in South Africa, and same thing happened in southern Rhodesia. That's not what happened here, and that's not what happened in Canada. That's not what happened in New Zealand or Australia. But those are different. Those are very different cases to Palestine. So I don't know what that tells us, but I do think you're right that there's a sense of beating into their heads that they're defeated, beating into their heads the idea that they can't win. That's behind a lot of this. It's very hard to explain it otherwise, actually, because it's not just sadism. It's not just brutality for brutality's sake. There is a political logic to it, and sometimes you get political leaders, especially on the right in Israel, who are in a sense the heirs of Jabotinsky. They actually tell the truth occasionally about what they're up to. Thank you all very much.